11. We're picking up in the life of David. Last couple of weeks we've been looking at the story of David and Mephibosheth. That was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. That was when David intends to show the kindness of God to a member of Saul's family. So someone that you wouldn't have really expected. Mephibosheth would have been an outcast, and David shows kindness to him. And then last time that I was here 2 weeks ago, we looked at the story of David showing kindness to the Ammonites. And the Ammonites were actually enemies of David. But David insists that the kindness of God has to be shown not just within the boundaries of Israel, but outside those boundaries to the nations. But of course the Ammonites reject that, and we looked a little about what that all means and what that points us to. Those are high points in David's life. Those shine a light on David's character that is really admirable. And that's important because as we come into chapter 11, we're looking at a story that is a low point in David's life, probably the lowest point of his reign as king. And yet it's such an important story for us to hear and to pay attention to. So 2 Samuel 11, we're going to read the whole chapter, and it's on page 486 of your pew Bible. Not next week, because that'll be the joint service at Park Lane, but the following Sunday, actually it'll be 2 weeks. Anyways, next time I'm here, we'll be looking at the second part of this story, which is when Nathan comes to rebuke David. In a sense, it's one long narrative, but it's really too much to tackle in one night, so we're going to break it up into 2 parts. So tonight it's 2 Samuel 11, page 486. In the spring, at the time when the kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't that Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. And when Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. And then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants, and did not go down to his house. When David was told Uriah did not go home, he asked him, "Haven't you just come from a distance? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents in my fields. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? Surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. And when the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerub-Besheth? Didn't a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you get so close to the wall?' If he asks you this, then say to him, 'Also, Uriah, your servant Uriah the Hittite, is dead.'" The messenger sent out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, "The men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." So David told the messenger, "Say this to Joab. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as the other. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab." When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife, and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Well, brothers and sisters, my son Derek came up with this analogy for me. He came to me one day and he said, "Dad, I got a sermon illustration for you." I said, "Okay, well, what is that?" He said, "Dad, you got to think of dominoes. The little dominoes you knock over." He says, "You know how you knock one over and it knocks over the next and the next and the next?" And I says, "Yeah." He says, "Sometimes doing something wrong is just like that. You do one little thing wrong and it leads to the next and the next and the next." I said, "Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a good illustration, isn't it?" So I said, "Derek, I'll use that sometime." So here I am. We're looking at the story of David, and in this story, it is like dominoes, isn't it? One mistake that one mistake that David makes, looking out the window one evening from the palace, leads to another, committing adultery, leads to another, committing murder, leads to another, lying about it all. It's like dominoes, one after the next, after the next, after the next. And before you know it, David has an absolute catastrophe on his hands, a catastrophe of his own making. One of the mistakes that we would make as we look at this story is keeping our distance from it. We would say, this could never happen to us. We wouldn't do something like this. And here's the thing, this story, one of the reasons this story is in the Bible is because there's a way that this story really is our story. This story doesn't just tell us the events that unfolded in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. This story really tells us and describes in vivid and painful detail human nature, my nature, your nature, our nature. And as we look at this story, I want us to see, we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the foolishness of sin, the foolishness of covering our own sin, and then the foolishness of the cross. Okay, the foolishness of sin, the foolishness of covering our own sin, and then finally the foolishness of the cross. One of the reasons that I love this story is because it reminds us that the Bible is not a collection of stories about all these people that we need to learn to try to emulate. There's a commentary series out there. It's the Be Like series. I don't know if any of you have ever heard it, but it's Be Like Job, Be Like David, Be Like Ruth, Be Like Esther. And it's a whole series of books. And each book is about these characters of the Bible, and the message of each of these books is telling us that we need to learn to copy the behaviors of the characters in the Bible. And as much as I appreciate what the author is trying to do, I think that is a flawed method of reading Scripture. I don't think that's how the Bible is meant to be read. The Bible is not a collection of characters and heroes that we need to look up to and admire and do our best to copy in our own daily life. And this story is proof positive that that doesn't work. Because here we have David, the one who is described as the man after God's own heart. That name, that title was applied to him, the righteous one, the righteous king. And what is he doing? He's committing adultery. He's committing murder. He's covering it up. He's lying about it. It's a devastating series of sins. It's dominoes falling one after the next. Now, how did this happen? David did not wake up one bright, beautiful Saturday morning and say to himself, what a nice day. I think I'm going to commit adultery and murder my best friend. Of course he didn't. That's not how sin works, is it? This story works in small little steps, one leading to the next, to the next, to the next, until the very end. There's no way, if you would have been able to go back in time to 5 years before these events took place, or even 1 year, or even 1 week before these events took place, if you were to say, David, do you think you'd ever commit adultery? David would say, of course not. I love the law of God. I love the righteousness of God. I want to obey God. And yet here he is. So how does it work? How does it happen? Satan works in steps, little steps. It's David looking out his window one evening, and rather than looking away when he is tempted, he continues to look. And rather than leave that behind, he actually sends a messenger to the lady next door. And rather than leave it at that, David then has that woman come over. And rather than leave it at that, which was bad enough by this point, David then orchestrates a scheme, which we'll dig into in a moment or two, by which his best friend is killed in battle. One little domino leading to the next until they all fall over. By the end of the story, I count at least 5 of the 10 commandments broken. Idolatry, adultery, murder, coveting, and bearing false witness. By my count, that's half the 10 commandments in one story. The man after God's own heart. Nowadays, we like to tell ourselves that people are basically good at heart. Right? You've heard that said. We're all good human beings. People are basically good. It's the environment that's wrong. It's society that's a mess. My family was no good, but I'm a pretty good person. This story shows us that it just ain't so. We can't say about human nature that we're all pretty good people. Dorothy Sayers was an essayist. She was a British writer back in around the time of the Second World War. Fabulous writer, very insightful, very witty, so her work is a lot of fun to read. She talks about the problem of evil in the world today. And one of the things that she says is that as Christians, we should never be surprised by the depravity and the evil that we see unfolding all around us. She goes on to say that atheists, or as she calls them, secularists, they always seem to be surprised. They always seem to think that it's unexpected when murders happen and school shootings and terrorism. Now, those are modern updating of what she was talking about. But she says, atheists and secularists are always surprised by these kinds of things. But as Christians, we shouldn't be surprised. We should be heartbroken, to be sure, she says, but never surprised. Why? Because the Bible tells us that human nature is deeply flawed and deeply fallen. Do you want to understand what's wrong with the world today? Do you want to understand the motive behind racism and gun violence and terrorism and all these other such things that plague the headlines? We have a good description of that here. Human nature is deeply flawed. It's sinful. We need to have a big view of sin. Now, I know some of you are thinking, spoken like a true Calvinist, right? Calvinists always seem to want to talk about sin, but really, we need to understand the power and the prevalence of sin in our world today. We should never undermine it. We should never minimize it. It's incredibly dangerous. In fact, the biggest mistake that we would make looking at this story is to say, I would never do something like David did. I realize that's a shocking thing to say. But as I read this story, and that was my first reaction, by the way, but then I got to thinking, am I saying that I am better than David? Are we better than David? See, the very sins that lurked in David's mind, the very seeds, lurk in our minds as well and in our hearts. The seeds of jealousy, covetousness, lust, anger. They may bear fruit in different ways in our life. But isn't it true that the seeds are in our hearts and minds as well. What does that mean for us? It means that when we recognize the seeds in our own heart and our own mind, we have to be vigilant to squash those seeds, to get rid of them. Peter says in the New Testament, watch out, be on your guard. Why? Because your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for whom he might destroy. Satan works in small little increments, in small little gradations, one little step at a time. So when we see the first little hint of sin, we need to identify it and ask that God would remove that from our lives, that He would give us the strength to resist. Because if we don't, it will give birth to the kinds of sins that we see here. Maybe not these exact ones, but similar in scale. So as important as all that is, that's the foolishness of sin. But that's not really what the story is about. This story is not so much about David's adultery. The real story here is the foolishness of covering our own sin. The first 6 verses cover the actual sin of adultery itself. But the rest of the story tells us about David's foolish and futile efforts to cover up his own sin. One writer says it this way, says that David makes 3 efforts to deal with the problem of what he has done. He makes a clean effort, a dirty effort, and a criminal effort. And actually, I think that's a pretty good way to look at it. If you look at verses 6 through 8, what happens? David hears that Bathsheba has become pregnant. And he knows that people will be able to do the math and figure out that, well, Uriah was away in battle, so how did this happen? And so, of course, he has to find a way to cover this up. So the first thing he does, that's the clean effort. What does he do? He calls Uriah, Bathsheba's wife, home from battle, and he pretends to get this report and this update on how things are going in the battlefield. And then if you look at verse 8, this is probably confusing to us because David says to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. Wash your feet. Why? Well, that was actually a euphemism. That's not literally going to the tap and scrub your feet clean. It's a euphemism for having sexual relations with your wife. So David is saying, go set the mood, sends a gift after him, flowers or a nice CD or something like that. And the idea is that Uriah is going to go home and the mood is going to be just right. And David figures that nature will take its course and the problem will be solved. But of course, Uriah has more character here than David does, because Uriah says, how can I go home and enjoy the luxuries of home and marriage when all my other fellow soldiers are still in the hardship of the battle? Right? Uriah has a moral compass here, and he won't do it. So he sleeps on a mat near the entrance to the palace. And David finds out about that, of course, and he's frustrated, but he can't show that because that would give the whole problem away. So David goes to the second plan. That's the dirty plan. It's a little dishonest. It's sneaky. He breaks out a nice vintage wine, pours a glass, and parties with Uriah, and the plan is to get him drunk so that Uriah will go home and do what he didn't do the night before. Well, that doesn't work either, does it? Uriah still, even though he did get drunk and he was intoxicated, he still won't give in, and he still has more character than we see David has in this story. So then the criminal effort, verses 14 through 17. This is shocking. In effect, what David has Uriah do is carry his own death warrant to his commanding officer. I mean, here's Uriah. He's going into battle with his own order for execution and giving it over to his commanding officer. David writes an order, put Uriah near the front of the battle lines where it's certain he'll be killed, and make sure that it happens. He signs off on that, puts it in an envelope, says, here, Uriah, just by the way, just give that to your officer. And he knows exactly what's going to happen. By the way, do you know who Uriah was? I mean, we know his name, we know his role in the story. Uriah was one of called David's mighty men. The mighty men of David's mighty men were a group of people that rallied around David when David was fleeing from Saul. They sacrificed their lives, they sacrificed their livelihood to protect David. And this is how David repays one of his good friends, one of his mighty men. Sends him off and puts him in the front lines where his own friend will be killed. He arranges for Uriah's death. Now I know, again, we hear this, and It's outrageous. It's shocking. What David is really doing is making a foolish and futile effort to cover up his sin, to make like it never happened. And before we point the finger too quickly at David, we better look at ourselves. Because maybe even we won't get involved in a scandal like this. But again, if we look at our hearts, we do the same thing. We find ways to deal with our sin all on our own. Right? We justify it. Have you ever done that? Well, I know I shouldn't be dishonest, but my situation is unique. My situation is different. And the rules don't exactly apply to me here. Right? You make excuses that way. You blame. Well, I shouldn't have said that to my spouse, but she started it. He started it. You minimize. Right. Wow, it wasn't such a big deal. Everybody's doing it. No big deal. Do you see what we're doing there? We're taking our sin and we're finding ways to deal with it all on our own. You say, I'm going to handle this sin. I'm going to be in charge of how to deal with it. It never works. It will destroy you every time. And I see at least two ways that it happens just from this story alone. When we cover our own sin, it leads to destruction and it deadens our conscience. What do I mean by that? Obviously, David's attempt to deal with his sin in this story doesn't work because the problem gets bigger and bigger every time instead of smaller and smaller. Psalm 32 is another psalm that David wrote. It's not the more famous one that David wrote after this whole incident. That was Psalm 51. But in Psalm 32, David, he wrote that psalm as well about sin that he never confessed in his life. And he said, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away, and your hand was heavy upon me. David was describing that. Maybe you've gone through an experience like that where you just try to keep silent. You don't want to acknowledge a sin or a mistake, and yet it will crush you. It will wear you out. It will weary you, and it will give birth to death. Just imagine with me, if you would, a man, maybe he grows up in a really crummy home. Parents are never there for him. He develops an anger problem. Gets married, 3-4 weeks into the marriage, they get into a fight. Start quarreling. He yells and screams. Maybe he throws something. Starts, rather than acknowledging that he has a problem, starts drinking. Becomes more and more prone to alcohol as a way to solve the problem, numb the pain. Has kids, brings kids into the marriage, and now he's taking out his anger on them. You've seen stories like that play out. One sin leads to the next, and it gives birth to death. It leads to destruction. And the other thing that it does is it deadens our conscience. I want you to look with me, if you would please, at verses 22 through 25. Uriah has been killed. The messenger is coming back to report to David what has happened, and the messenger is worried that David is going to be angry because he's going to hear how the battle plan went down, and it was a battle plan that really made no strategic sense. The messenger doesn't know that there's a whole other plot going on here. So the messenger figures when David hears this, he's going to go berserk. So he tells him this, but look at David's reaction in verse 25. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as the other. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. How callous can you get? Remember, David was the man that when Saul, his enemy, was killed on the battlefield, his enemy, Saul wept and he cried and he lamented the death of his enemy. And he said, that was the Lord's anointed. And now here we are. His best friend has been killed because of his actions. And David just says, oh, well, people die in battle. It's no big deal. Happens all the time. You see how it's just numbed him because of his own sinfulness. Isn't it true that the hardest sin that you commit is the first one? The hardest lie is the first one. It gets a little easier the next time you have to tell a lie. and the time after that, and the time after that. Every time, it's amazing how easy it gets because a part of your conscience is numbed, and that's what's happening here. Sin is incredibly foolish, but even more foolish is what happens when we try to deal with it ourselves. So what do we do about it? What should we do? Well, this story, the point of this story, one of the main points of this story, besides showing us the foolishness of sin and besides showing us the foolishness of trying to handle it ourselves, is an invitation to confession, because it's showing us here's what goes wrong when you do it yourself. What do we need to do? We need to confess our sin. The problem with that, or the difficulty with that, if you look in verse 27, the last sentence of this whole story, we read that the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. God has, in a sense, been just in the background of this whole story. He hasn't been mentioned, he hasn't spoken until the very end. And we read, of course, that God is angry. He is displeased with what David has done. And rightfully so. Rightfully so. But how do we confess to a God who is angry at sin? How do we acknowledge our sin prayerfully to God when we know that God doesn't take sin lightly? How will God respond to David if he were to confess? Maybe one of the reasons David is afraid to confess is because he fears what the Lord will say. We can only speculate, but to come to God and say, Lord, I've committed adultery, that's a fearful thing. How will God respond to that? How will God take sin seriously? Today we wonder that, I think, often. We don't like the idea of a God who is angry. We don't like the idea of a God who punishes, but we also don't like the idea of a world where evil seems to get away and run away unchecked. When we see that a violent offender gets off with a slap on the wrist, we get angry. We want justice to be done. And how much more doesn't God want justice done in this world? And so the question is, how will God respond when we bring our sin to Him, when we deal with our sin by bringing it into the open? How will a just God respond? The answer isn't directly found in this story, but we do see something of what we call an anti-negative example that points us to a positive reality. So we see a negative example here of everything that goes wrong, but it ultimately is meant to make us look for a positive reality, sort of the mirror image that is the positive flip side, if you will. What is the anti-type? What is the negative part? Well, what is David doing? How is he trying to cover his own sin? Ultimately, through the death of an innocent man. David is saying, if I can put this man to death, now he's not quite structuring it that way, but in effect that's what happens. Through the death of an innocent man named Uriah, David is hoping that his sin will be gone and forgotten. There will be no one to tell what David has done, because Uriah will be dead. So in effect, David puts to death an innocent man as a way of covering his own sin. Of course, Uriah was that innocent man, and he was put to death without his knowing about it. He was put to death against his will. David sort of forces him into it without Uriah even knowing what was going on. David is motivated by selfish reasons. David is motivated by pride. David is self-serving in all of this. And he puts to death an innocent man. But in the fullness of time, a better sacrifice would come. And that, of course, is the Lord Jesus Christ. How does God deal with our sin? Through the death of an innocent man. But in the case of Jesus, it wasn't someone being forced to go to death against his will. He wasn't put into it unknowing. Jesus willingly laid down his life. He willingly sacrificed his life. He willingly died to save the very people like David, murderers and adulterers and liars. Uriah was forced to death against his will. Jesus came and says, I lay down my life willingly. My life is mine to give. And that is how God deals with sin. He doesn't cover it up and pretend it's no big deal. He doesn't sweep it under